Welcome to the University of Kansas School of Law's Office of Career Services Boot Camp on Behavioral and Situational Interviewing. My name is Meredith Wiggins, and I am the Assistant Director for Career Services. In this presentation, we will provide an overview of what behavioral and situational interviewing are and what they're designed to do. We'll then break the interview response down into its component parts and provide examples of strong responses in this line. Lastly, we will cover a few important tips to keep in mind as you prepare for these types of interview questions. Situational and behavioral interviewing are similar types of interview questions that encourage interviewees to respond with a narrative, often based on specific experiences they faced in the past, whether in work, school, extracurricular activities, or another area. While the terms are often used interchangeably, technically, behavioral questions will ask how you handled a past challenge, and situational questions will ask how you would respond to a future challenge. In situational questions, you can definitely still reference past experiences as support for why you would take a certain kind of future action. It doesn't have to be an entirely hypothetical response. Depending on the depth of the question, you should usually aim to answer in approximately 1 to 2 minutes. While most employers will ask at least a few of these kind of interview questions, they are very heavily used in federal job interviews, where it's not unheard of for the entire interview to be behavioral or situational questions. One method for responding to these types of interview questions is through the STAR method. STAR stands for Situation, Task, Action, Result, an acronym that encompasses each of the elements that should be included in this type of interview response. For a behavioral question, these responses begin with describing the situation, or the general circumstances in which the story you're telling took place. Next is the task, the particular goal, whether explicit or implicit, that you needed to accomplish in the story. Then comes the action, the steps that you took in order to complete the task or goal. Finally, and perhaps most important, is the result. What happened in the story because of what you did? For situational questions, you can still use this format. You just do so with reference to the particular hypothetical situation posed. Now, let's explore each of these components in more detail for a behavioral interview question. The first component of a STAR response is the situation, where you should focus on providing your interviewers with the necessary context in order to understand the narrative you're telling. The amount and kind of information you include in this portion of the response will vary depending on the specific question, but may include information like when or where the event took place, why you were there, and who else was involved in the story. For a behavioral interview question, you'll be pulling details from a specific past example. For a situational interview question, the situation may have been included in the hypothetical you were given, or you may need to start by saying something like, I'd want to begin by assessing the situation or the context that's contributing to this issue, so I can figure out what I'd really need to know to respond appropriately. In this case, that might be, and you'd go on from there. The next component of STAR interview responses is the task. In this portion of the response, you're addressing the problem that you needed to solve within the context of the situation. What was the challenge in front of you? One thing to keep in mind is that tasks can often be both explicit and implicit. For example, if you're discussing a time you had to deal with a customer whose order was significantly delayed, the explicit task or challenge might involve figuring out why the order is running late and getting it to the customer as quickly as possible, while the implicit task or challenge is to make the customer feel taken care of or satisfied. Particularly strong STAR responses will usually deal with both. For a situational or hypothetical question, you can move into this portion of the response by saying something like, based on the hypothetical you've laid out, I would want to figure out what the true issue or problem is. In this case, it sounds like it might be XYZ. To address that, I would do ABC, and so on. The next step in a behavioral or situational interview response is the action. This portion of the response details what you did in order to resolve the problem or challenge that you were faced with in that moment. Thinking back to the task portion of the response, if you were faced with both an explicit and an implicit challenge, make sure that your answer addresses both aspects. Make sure you're providing specifics here rather than just glossing over the action you took. The interviewer wants to hear about how you solve the problem step by step, as part of what these kinds of interview questions are intended to do is to show your thought process. And again, for a hypothetical, you could say something like, based on the information I'd gathered, I would then do X, Y, Z. The final and most important part of the behavioral interview response is the result. Every answer to a behavioral interview question should conclude by demonstrating how your actions led to a positive outcome of some kind, whether that's an improved process, a completed project, or a solved problem. Forgetting to include the result is a common behavioral interview mistake. Some people even intentionally omit the result because they think it seems like bragging, but it's not. It's a key component of this kind of interviewing, and you should always include it in your answer. And for a hypothetical question, again, you can adapt this to state what you project the outcome might be for the situation posed. For example, by saying something like, well, by doing X, I would hope to achieve Y result. On this slide, you can see an example of a common behavioral interview question, one that focuses on how the interviewee handled making a mistake in the workplace. One clue that the interviewer is looking for a star interview response is if the question includes the phrase, tell us about a time, as it does here. To address the situation, the interviewee starts by providing context necessary to the story they're telling. Rather than just saying, one time I slept through my alarm and I was late to work the next day, they point out that they were asked to work a busy shift on a day they weren't typically scheduled, and that they had prepared for that by setting an alarm to wake them up. Both of these details imply that they're generally a responsible person, which is helpful information for understanding the kind of person they want to show themselves to be in this answer. The interviewee next quickly summarizes the task or the problem. They need to solve the explicit problem of being late to work during a busy time, but there's an implicit task too. What are the steps that they will take to resolve the problem that they caused their teammates by being late? Notice that the action narrated here addresses multiple levels of the task. The speaker addresses the immediate problem by giving their coworkers an ETA and getting to work as fast as possible. But they also address the larger problem of having failed to follow through on a commitment and creating a problem for their team by going out of their way to take responsibility for their mistake and to recognize their coworkers' work to management. And finally, the result. The speaker says what they learned from the experience, the importance of accountability, and makes it clear that the mistake actually led to longer term positive effects with their team. As I mentioned earlier, omitting the result is one of the most common mistakes in behavioral interviewing. It's not bragging, it's providing helpful information to the employer. Here's another common behavioral interview question, this one about teamwork experience. It's not as explicit as tell us about a time, but it does give you an opportunity to talk about specific experiences rather than just generalities. And here's an example behavioral interview answer of approximately 2 minutes that follows the STAR format. Feel free to pause the video and read through this slide, making note of each aspect of the situation that the speaker addresses. This slide addresses the task for the behavioral teamwork question. Pause the video and read through it. This slide addresses the action for the behavioral teamwork question. Pause the video and read through it. And here's the result for the behavioral teamwork question. Pause the video and read through it. Here's a common situational or hypothetical interview question. Again, while your answer should focus on what you would do in the specific case they offer you, you can definitely use past experiences as support for why you might choose to follow a certain path, and the STAR method can work here too. Take a minute to read through the example on the screen. Notice how it follows the basic STAR format of assessing the situation, figuring out the task, taking action, and then addressing the result, even in a hypothetical response. And finally, a few last tips to keep in mind about behavioral and situational interviewing. Because these kinds of questions are common, it's a good idea to brainstorm potential answers in advance. Having a couple of strong, relevant possible answers ready to go helps prevent that dreaded post-interview, ugh, I just thought of a great answer moment. In the same vein, don't plan to wing it in the interview. Instead, practice talking through your answers in advance so you'll have a good idea of what you're going to say so that you've included all the most pertinent information. And again, Do not leave out the result. Employers want to hear about how your actions contributed to outcomes. You need to demonstrate that connection in your answer. And you need to make sure that you are addressing all parts of the question. If a question does have multiple parts, for example, tell us what you did and tell us the lesson you took away from it, you need to make sure that you address both parts of that question. We hope this presentation is helpful to you as you prepare for and take part in the interview process. Please reach out to the CSO if you have any additional questions, and rock chalk!